Hi, I'm Femi OK. You're watching The Stream. Today, how big a problem is white supremacy in US police forces? The Southern Poverty Law Center studies hate groups in the United States. This is what they told us earlier about white supremacists in US police forces. Have a listen, have a look.
Law enforcement and military personnel tend to be the most sought-after recruits among far-right extremist groups. Part of that is because they have an understanding of situations like what we saw on January 6th that your average recruit would not have. Then on purely the issue of race, it's obviously disgusting to have law enforcement officials who are white supremacists. It doesn't take exactly a brain surgeon to figure out why that would be the case. If you have somebody who believes that race comes above country, race comes above anything else in society, they are that much more likely to create terror in the population and do it under the guise of authority.
A few thoughts to get started. I'm sure you have many more and questions for our expert panel. Looking forward to hearing those. Just put your comments into the comment section and I'll try and get some of your thoughts into today's discussion. I want to say hello to the guest. The guest will say hello to you. Mike, Cynthia, Shannon, thanks for being on the stream today. Mike, welcome back to the stream. Remind our audience who you are, what you do.
Thank you for having me again. My name is Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law School. Prior to that, I was an FBI special agent for 16 years, where some of my cases involved infiltrating white supremacists and far-right militant groups as an undercover agent.
Thanks for coming back, Mike. Hello, Cynthia. Tell our international audience how you would like to describe yourself and what you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cynthia Miller-Idris. Thank you for having me. I'm a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., where I direct the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, or PERIL. And I also recently finished a book called Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right.
Oh, so timely, amazing, Cynthia. Thanks for joining us. And hello, Shannon. Welcome to the stream. Introduce yourself.
I'm Shannon Foley-Martinez. I am a consultant at PERIL, where Dr. Miller-Idris works. I'm also a former violent white supremacist. I've been out of the movement for over 25 years, and I work towards helping off-ramp and disengage people who are currently still in far-right spaces. And my area of passion is actually working on prevention so that we can better inoculate people from ever finding resonance with any of this stuff in the first place. I also have 7 kids, hence why I'm coming to you from like bunker shed here. It's the only place my kids won't disrupt me.
Shannon, looking forward to hearing more from you in just a moment. Mike, I have to share this with you on my laptop. This was something that caught our eye on the stream just before we went to air. 2 U.S. Army National Guard members with ties to fringe right group militias are being removed from the security mission to secure Joe Biden's presidential inauguration, an Army official and senior intelligence officials say. That's so on topic for what we're talking about. I'm just thinking about all of the work that you've done over many, many years. I know you can't be surprised about this, but why does it happen?
Well, it's been a persistent problem for the entirety of our history, right? I mean, I think people forget that our nation was founded as part of a white supremacist project, right? European colonization of the so-called New World. In fact, it was a world inhabited by other people, but white supremacy was baked into the religion and theology and philosophies of the European colonists that came here, and that white supremacy was codified in our laws for hundreds of years. And for much longer than it hasn't been, right? It's really just since the civil rights movement that racial discrimination has been legally barred. But of course, that didn't change things overnight. And law enforcement, not just law enforcement and military, all U.S. institutions are infected by that foundational history. And it remains a problem that we unfortunately don't really address head on. But, there's a reason why corporate boards are mostly white and Congress is disproportionately white. The officer corps or general officers in the military are disproportionately white. These are all part of the lingering structural racism that exists in our society.
I'm just looking at some more pictures on my laptop, Cynthia. Cops taking selfies with the terrorists, not my words, Timothy Burke's words. And then 2 off-duty Virginia police officers are charged in the Capitol riot. Let me just scoot up a little bit so you can see them. Are you looking at this and thinking, I told you so. We've been telling you about this for so long. What did you not see?
I mean, it does feel a little bit like that, although I try usually not to present myself that way. I'll say I published a piece in Foreign Affairs that I know a lot of people have read in December that was called, When the Far Right Penetrates Law Enforcement, which was really talking about the problem of white supremacist extremism in law enforcement and the military and veteran communities, and comparing it to investigations that are ongoing in Germany. So, this isn't just a US problem. There are other countries grappling with it as well. And I would say, I think there's really 2 different issues. I agree with Mike that, you can't really understand white supremacist extremism without understanding the foundation of white supremacy that it's built on. So that first and foremost has to be understood, that police officers and law enforcement grapple with the same kinds of biases and the need for anti-racist practice and training that everybody else who's white in this society really deals with. But it's also the case, I think, that that there's active recruitment going on from within the militia and far-right scenes of law enforcement officers who are highly prized recruits within those, as we've heard already on this program. And so you have a kind of, on the one hand, as far-right extremism and other forms of extremism go up in a society, they're partisan individuals like anyone else, and maybe just as vulnerable to recruitment as anybody else is. But it's also the case that they're targeted for recruitment in different ways. And so we have to actually see them as more vulnerable and not just susceptible. There's no protective factor that comes from being a police officer that would help you necessarily ward off the recruitment advances of a white supremacist extremist group or a patriot militia.
I want to show you, Shannon, a little bit of a presidential debate that was hosted by Fox News last September. I'm going to play the clip to you, and I want you to come off the back of that clip immediately. First thoughts, no filter. Let's play that clip.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. Do you want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
white
like
me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
Well, they heard the message, as we saw on January 6th, 2021. They definitely stood by. In the most robust terms, if we cannot name the problem and we cannot say violent or overt white supremacists in addition to the systemic white supremacy in which we live is the problem, if we can't even name that problem, then there is absolutely no hope of fixing or mitigating the problem whatsoever.
I'm just looking here at YouTube, Mike, a lot of people talking about white supremacy and arguing about it. So Nalasha says, how much did President Donald Trump contribute to what happened at the Capitol building last week?
I think his contributions were significant, not just that clip back during the debates, but post-election, his protests that the election was stolen, and that he wanted people to activate, to come out and show their displeasure. So, I think looking at the period that I was doing the undercover work in the 1990s, a lot of people ask me what has changed, and they tend to focus on the internet and social media, but that really hasn't changed nearly as much as you would imagine. What changed was you had a president of the United States and the top authority figure encouraging these groups to mobilize and praising them when they engaged in violence against the political enemies he designated. And that was problematic because he also has an audience in law enforcement and in the military that he was talking to. So he was basically putting those entities all on the same side. And that's really different, is that they didn't have that kind of top cover where they could come out and commit public violence that the police did not address, and the FBI didn't prevent the internet or interstate travel that they were engaged in. So they've now built networks that make it easier for them to gather in mass in order to commit violence. And that public violence unpoliced conditions them to believe not just that it's okay, but it's actually authorized, that they are allowed to engage in this activity. And when the police don't react, there's nothing to make them believe it's not true. So, we're in a differing period now where there is some law enforcement action, but it'll be key for the public to make sure that law enforcement actually addresses the violence that's been going on for the last 4 years all around the country, not just what happened at the Capitol, as if that was an isolated event.
Sure. Let me just play a little clip, just 10 seconds of a riot so you can see it. And then remember that in that crowd were some law enforcement members who were also rioting. Have a look. Cynthia, many people have pointed out that the way that law enforcement dealt with the crowds is very different than the way they dealt with Black Lives Matter protesters in the same area. In Washington, D.C., in the summertime, there were Black Lives Matter protests, and they were shown out in force. There was military, there were guardsmen, there was tear gas. There was a very different response. Can you unpack that more for us?
This is, I think, exactly what we're talking about when we talk about bias, right? So police bias and who is deemed a threat. And it becomes clear, we now know from some of the reporting that's already been done, that there actually was very good intelligence in a report 3 days prior to the Capitol Police that warned them of violent attacks on the Capitol, that warned them of what could happen, and that intelligence was not taken into account. And so, of the many scandals and of the many, parts of the history book that will be written about January 6th, the utter failure of law enforcement to adequately prepare and address in advance what happened has got to be up there. And I think those images just of police in riot gear in June versus police in ordinary uniforms in January is going to stick with us for a really long time. And now I live in Washington, D.C. We're in a militarized city, essentially, with 25,000 troops and military checkpoints and bridges closed. And I mean, I've never seen anything like this in my life. So now we're in this situation where we've, of course, things have gotten so bad that it has to go much further in the other direction. So the ongoing securitization, because we're unwilling to deal with these things at their root and address it here through prevention and intervention, means that we end up with this situation where in the end result, a lot of this bias and inadequate preparation made things much, much worse.
I'm just going to share some images with you. This is on my laptop from the Washington Post, who covered the Capitol building riots and also have covered Black Lives Matter protesters. And they're showing you the difference. So Capitol riots, a rioter being held with police with tear gas, Black Lives protesters being tear gassed by the police. Capitol building riots, Black Lives Matter protesters. You can see the difference here. And again, Capitol building riots, Black Lives Matter protesters here. Very different approach. I am wondering, Shannon, within some of the multiple factions that make up white supremacy groups, are they aware of this weakness in the way the police deals with them?
Well, I mean, here we are on a all-white panel talking about white supremacy in the U.S. police force. Like, that's pretty telling in and of itself, right? Like, yes, they're aware of it. There was a strategic shift towards the end of my time in the white power movement for this particular infiltration to begin to happen, to purposefully enter into policing, into the military, into teaching, into government offices, so that that there could be influence exerted from inside these spaces. And I would disagree a little bit that I do think that the internet has played a role. Obviously, yes, the commander-in-chief of this nation basically giving a free pass has an enormous impact. But we know, like, Facebook took down a giant police group where there was all kinds of white supremacist stuff being shared and infiltrated, and that the internet allows for this connectivity and also for the normalization of overtly white supremacist ideas amongst police forces beyond one's local area. And I think that the influence of that and that connectivity and the ability to organize, mobilize, and normalize what they're doing is incredibly important.
Can I put this to you, Mike? This comes from YouTube, from Angry Panda. How can these white supremacists be weeded out from law enforcement and all of society? How do you change their thinking?
So I think changing the thinking would be extremely difficult. That what we have to focus on, or what the FBI has to focus on, and I think that's an important part of the conversation that doesn't get mentioned. There are two different problems here, right? One is violence from the white supremacist far-right militant groups that, again, often include law enforcement or military, or former law enforcement or military, or at least have connections to them. And the other is the discourse in our society, in the marketplace of ideas. And those are two different problems, right? But trying to focus on these militant groups without recognizing that our discourse is distorted, right? The Secretary of State of the United States just put out a tweet about how we have to get rid of the isms, and of course wasn't talking about the fascism. And he was talking, he said wokeism, this idea that a multicultural society is a threat to America rather than something that helps America. So if we differentiate what those two problems are, we have different tools for addressing them, right? Law enforcement is not an effective tool for addressing our dislike for what they say or will think. What law enforcement should do to address people in law enforcement who are acting and behaving in a racist manner, or actively associating with groups that engage in white supremacist or far-right militant illegal activities. That's something that law enforcement can deal with. And the FBI has ample tools, right? For all the resources the FBI puts into its counterterrorism program, it also has the obligation to investigate violations of civil rights, and that includes color of law violations by the police. So they have plenty of complainants coming to them saying, I was beaten by a police officer who used racial epithets as he beat me, or I was unfairly targeted because of my race. And those investigations don't receive the type of resources and attention and effort that the FBI puts into other kinds of cases. The FBI works every day with state and local law enforcement. Those officers know who the problem officers are, right? But they don't have whistleblower protections that are strong enough to protect them if they report those officers. So part of this problem, and I wrote a report on this called Hidden in Plain Sight, because that's what it is. They know who they are. The FBI knows who the police officers they can trust and the police officers they can't trust are in these departments. It's a matter of actually having the will to address the problem, and that's what's lacking.
I want to bring in one more voice to our conversation. This is Rashawn Ray, who basically lists, it's like, this is what we need to do now. Have a listen to Rashawn.
Has there been enough national incentive to curb the infiltration of white supremacy in law enforcement? The simple answer is no, and the Capitol coup highlighted that. But understanding this links back to the founding of the United States of America, where enslaved black people would flee plantations and be tracked by what are called slave patrols. Slave patrols actually started law enforcement in the United States. So what do we do about it? Well, the Biden administration has an uphill battle here, but I think he's assembled a Department of Justice that is primed for it. First, people need to be investigated and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Second, we need to strengthen hate crime laws. Third, we need to create a national hate crime group registry. And fourth, we need to do thorough background checks to ensure that people who become law enforcement and go into the military do not hold white supremacy ideology and are linked to white supremacist groups.
Cynthia, can you pick up off the back of that?
Yeah, I like Rashawn's points a lot. I would only add to that I think in addition to those points, we need mandated data reporting at the level of the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice, because I think one of the problems, and this is the professor data hat that I wear, it's very difficult. We have anecdote after anecdote after anecdote that really shows an ongoing problem, but it's very difficult to counter the argument that it's just a few bad apples if we don't have the data that shows the nature of the systemic problem. And so I think that there have been, repeated attempts to get that reporting and to make it more systematic so that we have reporting from across all the local departments, that we actually understand the nature of the problem, the percentage of officers. And I would also add, not just the need to investigate people at the time of recruitment and training, but also in a periodic and ongoing way, because we know that officers remain vulnerable, just as other people do remain vulnerable to the propaganda, persuasive rhetoric, and manipulative efforts of extremist groups, and that they may, once they're already officers for some time, still become mobilized. And that's some of what we're seeing now. So I don't think it's enough to only look at it at the moment of recruitment and training and incorporation into law enforcement, but that we have to have periodic checks.
I'm picking up some negativity on YouTube. That always never happens. Shannon, Erica and Nate say you can't change their thinking. White supremacists in the police force, you can't change their thinking is what Erica and Nate are saying. And you say what?
Well, I am a living example that you can change thinking. I think it requires a lot of investment. I think it also requires, particularly when we're talking about military and police officers, some real soul searching about the roles and functions that they play, and that we understand that some of the training that's involved is actually something which increases the vulnerability of people to find resonance with, if you get one person who, slips past the sensors or whatever, the screening as they're coming in, and you have one charismatic person, that the conditions and the training that's involved actually leave people incredibly vulnerable, because they're looking for a sense of brotherhood. They're looking for this heroic narrative. Their jobs are incredibly trauma-inducing a lot of times, and the messaging that we give to our police officers as sort of like a protected, instead of being servants of us, that they're sort of a protected status. But we can change that, and part of it is we need to do a better job holistically and culturally.
All right. If you want to follow our guests, you can do so. You can follow their work online on Twitter. Have a look here. Shannon on Twitter, Cynthia on Twitter, and Mike on Twitter. highly recommend you follow Rethink Intel. Thank you, everybody, for your YouTube comments, for being part of this program. I will see you next time. Take care.